Essentially, a theme that you're going to hear over the course of this presentation is that there was a crisis before the crisis with respect to housing in the tornado-impacted area, and there's going to be a crisis after the crisis as we come on to winter in the coming months. So we'll talk a little bit about the prior conditions, about tornado impact, about the housing needs today, about the work that the task force and the city is doing to drive recovery, and about some of the remaining needs. So with that, I'm going to zoom through the first 3 slides on prior conditions, but all this goes to show is, again, there was that crisis before the crisis. The impacted area, the impacted neighborhoods had lost about 11% of their population between 2010 and 2020 and had a significant amount of vacancy prior to the tornado. And the most complete data set that we have, and really the only way to get a complete picture is really by amalgamating a few different data sets. But the most complete data set that we have is FEMA individual assistance data. And what that shows is that there's been 11,420 households that have been impacted by the tornado and applied to FEMA. That's over 25,000 individuals. And so individuals in that area were often paying well below fair market rent for the city, and therefore cannot afford the units that are available. And essentially what we learned, we've now received over 100 responses from landlords sharing their vacant units. We have an inventory now of over 700 vacant units across the city, and only less than 50 were under $1,000. The average was about $1,300. And we really appreciate our partners, including the United Way, Red Cross, Metro Housing Collective, many others, for their help both putting this survey together and issuing it to landlords and collecting this data. But what it showed is, again, this incredible gap in our housing market, which explains why so many families are struggling to find new housing. The next category here is shelter. Which the Department of Human Services estimates that the need for mass shelter this winter, in light of the number of displaced households, we need to be prepared to house an additional up to 1,000 households this winter, and that will cost in excess of $15 to $20 million. So ARPA is really designed, the overall compliance framework is designed to require the city to obligate the funds contractually for defined purposes by the end of 2024, and then spend the monies on those purposes by the end of 2026. So unfortunately, while we have tried to exercise as much flexibility as possible, and the word we use is targeting ARPA funds. So in the case where ARPA funds were allocated or obligated for housing production, we can target them to housing production in the tornado impacted area. Same with home repair. We had ARPA funds appropriated for home repair generally. We can target them further into the tornado impacted area. But where ARPA funds are appropriated for something that is unrelated to the tornado, it is very difficult to change that.
Data centers. What this resolution does is that if passed, it would affirm the Board of Aldermen's support for enacting clear, concise, thoughtful regulations within the 5-month time frame outlined in the executive order, as well as puts in conditions that need to be followed now during the conditional use process.
It is truly the global AI boom that is in part fueling the very rapid development of data centers and the growing need for data processing power across the globe and in the United States. Just a number to put a little bit of a scale to the investment that is being made and projected. McKinsey estimates a $7 trillion investment globally by 2030, which is really not that far away. Next slide, please. There are many types and sizes and functions of data centers. They're not all the same. There are corporate or enterprise data centers that are really for a single user. There are co-location or kind of large co-location wholesale data centers that function a little bit differently, sort of leasing out space for many different users. their telecom data centers and their hyperscale data centers, which are the kind that are sort of designed to scale resources and compute power up and down to grow with the kind of unique demands of often very large single customers like the major tech companies, Google, Amazon.
So where we were, where the city was not a good place for regulating data centers, and I think we can all agree with that. I hope we can at least. And so with Executive Order 92 and where we are now, just a few short weeks later, there are conditions in place for data centers and a regulatory framework that is beginning to be established. Some of the important things that Executive Order 92 and this mirroring resolution do are the following that I think are very important. One, it's directing city officials to establish those regulations under some specific guidelines, which I'll discuss later, and the planning department will go more in depth on. The water division is directed to look at water rates, the water infrastructure, and more around data center usage of this incredibly important resource we have. And I have highlighted here that it does, in this current executive order and this resolution that mirrors it, prohibits data centers from being permitted by right in any district. If you looked at that map and saw those data centers downtown, many of them were permitted by right, which means that, or all of them, so they never had to go through a conditional use process at all. They were permitted as warehouses. That is no longer the case as of the executive order. There will not be a data center that is going into play in St. Louis from this point forward that does not have a public hearing. And I just think that is so crucial and such.
So in the environmental considerations that we'll go through, I mean, beyond just noise pollution, air quality, and the potential impacts on biodiversity, data centers use an enormous amount of energy. Most of that energy is going towards actually cooling the system itself, with the next biggest portion to actually run the servers. And when we think about the scale of energy, for example, to put something into context, a 100,000 square foot data center could use at least 100 megawatts of power, and that's enough energy to power 18,000 homes for a year. So this creates a challenge for our utilities to meet the energy needs of data centers and our residents, and then lock in those long-term agreements with data centers. So this means we need new power generation or transmission infrastructure, and currently those costs are paid by the ratepayers. There are new state regulations that allow utilities to charge ratepayers for construction of new power generation before they're actually completed and generating energy.
What data centers mean for our economy. I've mentioned that they do generate very few permanent jobs directly associated with the facility and its operation itself. So for example, for a roughly 100,000 square foot facility, you might have 10 people at any given time in those jobs that Alicia was describing operating the facility, but they do rotate in shifts to ensure successful operation of the data center throughout the day. So there may be a few very direct permanent jobs on site. They are high wage. These are pretty well-paying jobs. I think the other job side of the coin is construction jobs in data centers. These are very capital-intensive facilities, so there is a lot of very specialized construction labor that is part of the upfront construction period. And because these facilities often need upgrades, some of those construction jobs do replenish. So there are construction jobs even as part of the need for recurring upgrades. Next slide, please. And finally, the experience in some other communities is that there is the potential to generate large amounts of tax revenue. In the state of Missouri, there are some state-level exemptions for data centers specifically from sales and utility taxes.
So just to bring us back to the piece of the executive order and the resolution that talks about the considerations required for regulations, I hope that that presentation showed you why there are so many things that need regulation. There's a lot of considerations around land use, the environment, the economy, and what is coming before us today. In terms of data centers, we do need to have some standards in place, regulations in place, know what is coming into our community, know how it's going to affect our community in so many different ways.
If you had to guess, an educated guess, on how many deaths per year does a data center cause?
I'm going to put this in perspective for you. We are looking at an industry that has potential enormous
I couldn't find it.
implication. You asked me a question, Alderman. I think you and I can go back and forth.
Sure.
Thank you. We are looking at an industry that has potential and has already been seen around the world to have potential on increased greenhouse gas emissions. And we know as a society, and I hope you agree with me, that climate change is one of the biggest threats to our society and to us as people. The number of deaths associated with climate change will continue to grow every single year. And the decisions that we make here as a Board of Aldermen and people who are residents of the world in general will matter for our children, for their children, and it is something that we need to think about very closely.